I get asked about fragments a lot. It seems like people really want to use them, but aren't really quite sure how. Well, we're going to go over not only how to use them, but how to use them effectively and without a lot of errors. So the first thing I would like to kind of change about your mind is something that parallels something we've already worked with. Remember this, the Android activity lifecycle? We have a particular startup sequence, we have a particular shutdown sequence, and here we're waiting for user interaction. The activity is concerned with everything that is going on that screen in Android. Well, fragments are activities 2.0. They're a refinement on a lifecycle type structure. This is the fragment lifecycle. If you notice, it looks very similar, but it has a couple changes. We still have our onCreate method and onDestroy, but we also have an onAttach and detach shutdown method. These particular methods are for when the fragment is actually something that gets attached to an activity. A fragment cannot live without something underneath it actually running it. The activity is what handles the context of the device and screen. So, the first thing that happens in a fragment's life is it gets attached. Right off the bat, it gets hitched to an activity. That activity has a context that will allow it to know how to be drawn. Only then do we actually hit our onCreate method. This is the moment that you actually create a fragment. Think of this as the place to put up setup code. Here's where things start to get a little different. We have an idea of onCreateView and onViewCreated. These particular classes work together. This one is the one you call in order to actually set up what you should look like. This is what you should do if you're relying on code that needs that to already have happened. You'll be using onCreateView a lot, and also on activity_created. So if you look at this onCreate method, and we go back to here, the Android activity lifecycle, we also see an onCreate method. Well, that is what onActivityCreated is. It's actually talking about the activities onCreate. Remember, these two things are going to be running in tandem. When you're coding, you're really going to want to stick to a certain pattern. You're going to want to stick to onAttach, onActivityCreated, and then onResume. These other particular methods are really for very special cases where you know the particular timing of them is important. I like to set up my views in onCreateView and then further refine them in onActivityCreated. The point is that throughout this life cycle, different particular moments will have different particular pieces available. And the reason why fragments are tricky for a lot of people is because they're not quite sure when particular variables are null and when they're actually pointing to something. You have to understand that Android handles the entire fragment connection between the activity behind the scenes. So, let's look at what that looks like in code. Here, you'll see that a fragment gets committed. The most important thing you need to know about this, and we'll go over it in another lecture, is that when something is committed, that does not mean that it's on the screen. It's put into a queue to be placed there at that time. You don't have any guarantee of when that fragment is going to be available and actually run. That life cycle is not under your control. It's under something called the fragment manager's control. The less that you actually keep pointers around to fragments, the more often you're going to not run into a null pointer exception. You should be creating them and allowing the fragment manager to decide when and where those particular fragments actually have their lifecycle get called. Again, this is all about taking care of our separation of concerns. Everything in the fragment class should be concerned with everything in that fragment. Any particular fragment class that you create is going to be treated just like an activity. It's going to be tied to some XML, and it's going to display something to the user. You want to make sure that this is encapsulated to be as tight and compacted with dealing only with the things that fragment needs to know about. If you actually end up taking functionality and making it depend on other classes without it being well thought out, you'll get into problems. Again, I'm going to show you exactly what happens when a fragment runs. And you can see the life cycle happen right before your eyes. It's attached, created, then create view, then view created. Notice now we actually have the ability to get the view that was created. Our state is restored if necessary, finally on start, and then on resume. Again, for a rotational element, everything gets torn all the way down from being paused, having a state to save, stopped, and then finally the view is destroyed. you'll find out that fragments on destroy gets called much more often than the activity on destroy. But you should still treat it as a place to clean up code, but not guaranteed. Now, what would be a really fun exercise for you to actually see how activities and fragments work out is on your own, take the activity project for the life cycle and take the fragment project for the life cycle and combine their code together. See if you can predict which particular method of which activity or fragment will get run and in what order. Once you see that, you can have that as a test application. I have one of my own. I actually just turn it on and off whenever I'm having a particular condition case where I'm wondering if I need to pay attention to something in my fragment or activity class. But by having a good understanding that the activity lifecycle is different but related to the fragment lifecycle, and trusting to make the fragment a activity onto its own, you'll create code that doesn't have issues, errors, or bugs, and is incredibly flexible with how it can be laid out.